we can simply hide it away. Sorry. At Environment North, we are very concerned that the decision to dump nuclear waste is essentially a done deal. We are worried that the nuclear industry and the federal government will simply sweeten the deal until they make our leadership an offer that they can't refuse. One of the people at the forefront of the original nuclear waste debate 30 years ago was Graham Saunders, who is also a past president of Environment North. And before I hand things over to Graham, I'd just like to thank the Faculty of Natural Resource Management who have sponsored tonight's venue, and thank you for coming. Graham?
Thank you, Julie. And it's a real pleasure for me to be able to introduce the two people you see up here. I'll tell you a little bit about what we plan for the evening. I'll do my brilliant introduction here, which will be very brief. And we'll do something a little novel, and then Gordon and Bob will talk about some of the issues they've come across. Later on, we'll get into comments and questions, and then we'll break up, and I'd like you to pause as you leave and take a look at the photographs if you haven't seen them already, and Bob also has some books for sale up here now, but they'll move back there somewhere. And then we'll move into well, this won't be formal ever, but this will be informal after this. If you want to talk more with Bob and Gordon, stick around. We'll have a bit of a talk after the formal session ends. I've known Bob in particular, Gordon for a long, long time, and you may see in a moment what I mean. Both Bob and Gordon have careers as academics in Montreal. Bob teaches at Concordia, photography in cinema, correct? And Gordon teaches at Vanier, mathematics. And I think I'll move over any other details you need to know about their credentials. You'll find out later on. But I'm going to switch over to, I guess, the déjà vu. And I said I've known Bob a long time. You'll see what I mean. Gordon for a long time. You'll see what I mean. Actually, I don't know Bob very long at all. I just met him today. So could we go back to the past? This is about 30 years ago. You'll see many things don't change.
Of industrial heat processes. I'm Graham Saunders. I'm the chairperson of the Citizens Committee studying nuclear waste. And at our conference today, Energy Conference, we have Dr. Gordon Edwards. He's the chairman of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. Gordon, welcome here.
Thank you, Graham. I'm glad to be here.
I have a few questions. I would like to hear a few things. I've heard it summarized, the whole question of nuclear energy, that it's unnecessary, that it's uneconomical, and it's dangerous.
So maybe you can carry on. Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm so happy to see so many friends here. My cousin is here. My mother grew up in Thunder Bay, and I had lots of aunts and uncles and cousins in Fort William and Port Arthur. And Bettina Miata is here, who fought the good fight in Atikokan against the nuclear waste dump back in the late 70s, and his voice was heard all the way down to the apartment buildings in Toronto, and had a big impact, really, on decisions at that time. Moreover, sorry, I should be holding this. Oh, I'm going to pass it to Bob. I think I'll just hold it because I'm going to pass it to Bob from time to time. What happened is we started a nuclear industry in Canada back in 1945. We started the first reactors operating here in Canada. They were just research reactors. So we have been producing high-level radioactive waste for a long time. And for 30 years, there was no mention at all of the problem of what to do with this radioactive waste. It wasn't, in fact, until the 1970s that the government first issued an official statement on the problem of radioactive waste in Canada. And at that time, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited seemed to target Northern Ontario as the logical place. I mean, where else would you want to put nuclear waste but in Northern Ontario? It's just such an inviting, I mean, after all, it's a beautiful country, so why not put nuclear waste there? And it was like wildfire. Really, opposition spread up right across Northern Ontario, in Atikokan, in Massey, down further south, in Thunder Bay itself. And one community after another just made it very clear that they didn't want Northern Ontario turned into a nuclear waste dump. It was really quite exciting. And as a result of that, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited slipped across the border into Manitoba. And near Winnipeg, north of Winnipeg at Lac Dubonnet, they built an underground waste research repository. So they couldn't face the music here in Northern Ontario. They went to Manitoba. And now today, Manitoba is the only province in Canada which has a law against importing high-level radioactive waste into the province. They have a law saying you cannot bring waste in here for burial. So, interestingly enough, those jurisdictions which have the most experience with nuclear waste, the ones who've done the most research and got the most economic benefits out of those research, they don't want to have anything to do with it. Now, something similar has happened in the United States. In the United States, the nuclear authorities declared 8 different times that they had found a solution to the radioactive waste problem. And 8 times they have failed. The most recent failure being Yucca Mountain. How many people here have heard of Yucca Mountain? A number of people, good. Well, Yucca Mountain is a mountain in Nevada, not very far from where the atomic tests were conducted, the bombs were exploded. And they thought that that would be a perfect place for radioactive waste. What has happened is that even though they spent about $10 billion on that project, it has now been completely scrapped because many assurances which the scientists had given turned out to be untrue. Recently, just in the last couple of months, Germany has announced that a repository which they chose many years ago as a good candidate for storing radioactive waste, it's called the Assa salt mine. And they now have declared that it was a monumental mistake, that they should never have done it in the first place. Vermont has made it clear in the States they want nothing to do with nuclear waste. They were told that there was going to be a nuclear waste repository built either in Vermont or in that neighborhood, and they said no way. Kansas has done the same, Nevada has done the same, New Mexico has done the same, and I think the word has to go out again here in Northern Ontario that this is just not an issue for one community. It's an issue for the entire region. Anything that goes wrong is going to affect the entire region. Any contamination that arises is ultimately going to affect our ecosystems, our water. All the transportation of radioactive waste is going to pass through, well, especially Thunder Bay if it's on its way, whether it's in Northern Ontario or whether it's in Northern Saskatchewan, it's going to pass through Thunder Bay. So I think that we have to get the word out that this is a regional issue. It's also a national issue. It's also a global issue. And that's, tonight we're here because, as you may have heard, the town of Ignace, Ontario has expressed an interest in knowing more about the idea of getting economic benefits and jobs attracted to their community by accepting a repository for high-level radioactive waste. So it's time to send out notice to people that it's now or never in terms of mobilizing to fight this, this situation. I'm not sure if I know how to advance the slides. Do I use the mouse? Just this one here? No. Oh, all right. I'm going to just quickly flip by this, this chronology. I'm not going to read it out, but these are things which have taken place over the years on the subject of nuclear waste. And the massive citizen opposition in Northern Ontario took place from 1978 to 1981. And the Nuclear Waste Fuel Act was passed in 2002, and the Nuclear Waste Management Organization was established also in 2002. Now, I'd just like you to know one thing. I don't know if you've heard. How many people here have heard of the NWMO, or the Nuclear Waste Management Organization? Okay, a few. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization, do not be fooled. It is not a government agency. It is the nuclear industry. It is owned entirely by the nuclear industry. Those are the people who created the waste. And they're the ones who have been put in charge with the problem of disposing of the waste. The difficulty is that there's a kind of a conflict of interest there. They would like it to make it appear that this problem has solved because they see it as a public relations obstacle to going ahead with their plans for expansion. Now we're going to move into the slideshow part of our program, and we begin with part one. What is nuclear energy?
You see here the mother element of all nuclear technology. This is a model of the uranium atom. Uranium is the heaviest naturally occurring element on Earth, and it has some very unusual properties that make it the mother element of everything nuclear.
Even though uranium was discovered 200 years ago, more than 200 years ago, it didn't have any real uses until World War II.
This is another model of the uranium atom. This is in downtown Elliott Lake, Ontario, the mining capital of Ontario. And it's a giant stainless steel sculpture, and that time of the day I arranged it so the sun was right behind the nucleus. And this is a symbol as good as any of the terrific power that the nuclear atom is capable of, and what it can do that is unique, which is that it can be fissioned, and in the process release energy and release more neutrons that will enable that fissioning to be self-sustained.
It's important to realize that uranium is the only naturally occurring substance which has this property, that it can sustain a so-called nuclear chain reaction. There is no other naturally occurring element that can do this. And for that reason, uranium is the key element behind all nuclear technology, whether civilian or military.
This is a monument to the splitting of the atom in the formerly closed city of Chelyabinsk, which was open when the Soviet Empire collapsed. I've been trying to get into the Soviet Union for a couple of years, and then in 1991, when everything fell apart, things opened up. And what's unusual about this statue, it's made in honor of Igor Kurchatov, one of the fathers of the Soviet A-bomb. It shows one atom being split, and you see those semicircular waves coming off of the sphere in the middle. Those are the waves of energy that happen when you split the atom. And the two spheres, the hemispheres, represent the atom now split. So they are the broken pieces of the split atom, and they fall to Earth in what we call nuclear fallout.
Now, these broken pieces of uranium atoms are highly unstable atoms, and for the most part, they do not exist in nature except insofar as we create them through splitting uranium atoms or plutonium atoms. If millions, if trillions of atoms are split simultaneously, then you have the power of the atomic bomb. But you also have hundreds of different fission products, because every time the atom splits, it splits in a slightly different way. Sometimes you might get substances like strontium-90. Another time you might get cesium-137. Another time iodine-131, or krypton-85, or argon-41. These are all the different names that are given to these broken pieces of uranium atoms, which are called fission products.
Here we see a nuclear weapons designer in charge of the tests in the Nevada test site. And I was talking to him about the necessity for nuclear testing, or would it ever come to an end? And he told me, first of all, he said, these are just some pretty pictures from the early days. And then he explained how the phenomenon of an exploding nuclear warhead is so complex that, and so interesting, that we will have no need to stop testing. We intend to test essentially forever.
Now, recently we've heard encouraging news that more and more influential people at the upper ranks of decision making, including President Obama, are saying that we need to create a world free of nuclear weapons, because these weapons are, in fact, suicide machines. When you have a war involving these kinds of weapons, nobody wins. If it has been calculated using the climate models, which are also used for climate change, that if India and Pakistan, for example, were to have a war that broke out into a nuclear war, and they were to explode, let's say, as many as 100 nuclear weapons, 50 on each side, that the dust from the firestorms and the radioactivity from the bombs would be enough to change the climate all over the northern hemisphere in one season. And we would have something akin to what's called nuclear winter, where it would be very difficult to sustain crops and life. But the thing I'd like to call your attention to is that this is the chief mechanism by which those fission products are disseminated into the environment. So all those hundreds of broken pieces of uranium atoms go up with the bomb and come down on our beautiful Earth. Now, I'd like you to think for a moment about the word radiation, because the word radiation is one of those buzzwords that often gives people the wrong impression. Light is a form of radiation. It's called electromagnetic radiation. Radio waves are electromagnetic radiation. Ultraviolet, infrared, these are invisible forms of electromagnetic radiation. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about atomic radiation. Atomic radiation is actually only produced by the disintegration of radioactive atoms. These are these unstable atoms that I was just referring to. When they disintegrate, they give off a sudden burst of energy, which is very damaging to living things. For example, I've highlighted here one of those fission products, iodine-131. Now, that's a radioactive form of iodine. Now, how many people know that your table salt has iodine in it? It's called iodized table salt. Do you know why the iodine is in there? It's actually preventative medicine. It's one of the few examples we have of preventative medicine. The iodine goes to the thyroid gland and prevents goiter, a disease of the thyroid. Well, radioactive iodine, iodine-131, does the same thing. It goes to the thyroid gland, and it also prevents goiter, but because it's unstable, it disintegrates. And when it disintegrates, it damages the thyroid gland. 5,000 children have had to, more than 5,000 I'm sure, have had to have their thyroid glands removed surgically in Belarus because of contamination with radioactivity from the Chernobyl accident more than 20 years ago. Another example of a fission product, as I've highlighted here, is cesium-137. Now, here's what I want you to think about. Don't think of radiation as being an invisible ray. Think of atomic radiation as being hundreds of different chemicals which are unstable and which have their own pathways in the environment and their own pathways in the human body. Some go to some organs, others go to other organs. Cesium-137 goes to the soft tissues of the body. And it's a problem for farmers because the animals their meat is unusable for human consumption if they have too much cesium-137 in it. That's where the cesium goes. Another substance is strontium-90. I've highlighted it here. Strontium-90 is also radioactive. It's another fission product. It's similar to calcium. Now, where does calcium go? It goes to the bones. It goes to the teeth. It goes to mother's milk. And that's where strontium-90 goes. So when you want to understand radioactive materials, remember that what we're talking about is dozens or hundreds of different chemicals which are unstable, and the radioactivity refers to that instability and the fact that they disintegrate. Now, here in Canada, although we participated in the world's first atomic bomb project, that's how we got started. We actually were partners with the United States and Great Britain in producing the world's first atomic bombs. The reason we were involved is because we had the only available supply of uranium in North America. It was up in Great Bear Lake, on the shores of Great Bear Lake in the Northwest Territories. But after the war, Canada decided to invest in peaceful uses of nuclear power. And this is a sort of a graphic illustrating the concept of a nuclear reactor, a can-do reactor, in fact. We have the core area of the reactor where you have uranium fuel, and in that core area, the uranium atoms are allowed to split, as we were talking about before, fissioning in a self-sustained chain reaction. That releases an enormous amount of energy in the form of heat. And that heat is used to boil lots of water and create lots and lots of steam. Once you've got steam, you can use it to turn a wheel, turn a turbine. And that's what generates electricity. In fact, that's the way most of our electricity is generated, by turning a wheel. That's the way water, hydropower works. That's the way fossil fuel plants work. That's the way a nuclear plant works. It's just another way to boil water.
This is an advertisement I took out of a nuclear magazine. It shows a nuclear engineer under the title, Small Wonder. And he's holding up between his thumb and forefinger a bit of uranium fuel, a fuel pellet. And it says how powerful it is, how it can do the work of carloads full of coal.
And of course, this is a very nice slogan, small wonder, because in fact, that is the main attraction of nuclear power. The main attraction is that you have such concentrated energy that you can achieve so much with just a small amount. What they doesn't tell you, though, in the advertisement, is that after you've used this pellet to generate electricity, you then have to keep your eye on it for the next 10 million years. You can't afford to throw it away ever, nor can your grandchildren, nor can your great-grandchildren, because it has been transformed into one of the most deadliest objects on Earth, irradiated nuclear fuel. And why it's deadly when it's irradiated is because all those fission products are now there. Strange thing is that if it was made of uranium only, you could hold it safely like that, because uranium gives off non-penetrating radiation called alpha radiation. But once those atoms are split, the fuel bundles, you see those fuel bundles in front of the man, each one of those fuel bundles is so radioactive when it comes out of the reactor that it would kill a human being in less than 20 seconds at a distance of 1 meter, because of the blast of penetrating radiation given off by the fission products. So, strangely enough, they call it spent fuel, but it's actually millions of times more radioactive than the fresh fuel. So we turn now to the question, which is already partly answered, I think. What is high-level nuclear waste?
This is a photograph I took of the Darlington reactor while it was under construction. It's a rare moment when it's not operational, and therefore a human being can stand in front of the face of the can-do reactor. Those tubes hold the fuel rods full of the uranium fuel. And once they get activated, no one can go anywhere near there. But at least this shows you the scale and the size of it.
Now, once the fission process begins, the fission products start building up in the fuel. And after a while, it's loaded with these fission products. By the way, the fission products from one of these reactors after 1 year would be more radioactive material than you would get from 1,000 Hiroshima-type bombs. So it's a tremendous amount of radioactive material. It turns out that nobody knows how to turn off radioactivity. You can shut down the reactor. You can stop the fission process, but nobody knows how to shut down the radioactivity. The result is that 7% of the full power heat is still being generated after the reactor is shut down. Now, that's an amazing fact. Most machines, if you turn them off, you say, well, now it's safe, it's turned off. Not a nuclear reactor. Even after it's turned off, you have to keep those pumps going. You have to keep cooling the core of the reactor. Otherwise, the heat from the radioactivity will actually melt the fuel at a temperature of about 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 2,800 degrees Celsius. And that's called a meltdown. Oops. Do we go back?
You skipped one.
I know, I don't know how to go back. Oh, previous, yes, right. I'm sorry, I don't know how this mouse works, really. Yeah, but how do I press this? Okay, I don't know how to get the previous one. Ouch. Thank you. Well, look, I won't dwell on this, but here's what a meltdown is. You've heard the word meltdown. What is it? Remember, this applies to a reactor even if it's completely shut down. The irradiated fuel produces decay heat from radioactivity. That's called decay heat. That decay heat can't be shut off, and it has to be removed. After shutdown, the decay heat is 7% of full power heat, and inadequate cooling at that point, after shutdown, will result in fuel melting. That's what caused the Chernobyl accident. That's what caused the 3 Mile Island accident. And that's what caused numerous other accidents that are not popularly known involving smaller reactors.
How long does it happen?
How
long does the decay occur?
Oh, the decay heat immediately after shutdown is 7% of full power heat. After about 1 hour, it's reduced to about 4% of full power heat, and it continues to decrease because the short-lived radioisotopes in the spent fuel decay rapidly. Nevertheless, even 2 days after shutdown, there is enough heat being generated by the irradiated fuel to melt the core of the reactor. In fact, that's what happened at 3 Mile Island. At 3 Mile Island, they lost effective cooling of the reactor for a very short period of time. The reactor shut down almost immediately, and by 2 days later, the reactor core was melting. So if you waited for a year, then that meltdown would be not possible, but you could still have enormous core damage without a complete meltdown.
And not only that, but they need to keep the spent fuel in these pools for 10 years before they can be taken out and put into cement silos. So this is the only photograph I dreamed about before I took it. I heard they're killing the reindeer in Swedish Lapland because they're all radioactive from Chernobyl, and I had this vision of a mountain of frozen reindeer. On my way to Russia, I stopped in Swedish Lapland and visited a reindeer meatpacking plant. And yes, the reindeer did have a lot of cesium in their muscle tissue, and there are limits. And if they're below the limits, they can sell it to people to eat. And if they're above the limits, they put them into this locker and keep these are the becquerel reindeer, they call them, the ones with limits that are too high. And I said, what do you do with that? And they said, well, we sell it to the mink farm down the road. So they recycle it. But this was a vision of the carcasses of reindeer too radioactive for human consumption because of the accident at Chernobyl.
Just by way of information, these reindeer were not killed by radioactivity. They were harvested in the normal way that beef or that any animal's meat is harvested. It's just that the food was unusable for human consumption because of the radioactive contamination. If you go on the internet, you'll see that there are hundreds of farms even today in northern England and in Wales where they cannot sell their sheep meat because of cesium contamination from the Chernobyl accident. That's many thousands of kilometers away, and 20 years after the accident occurred. This is the problem with disseminating these radioactive materials into the environment. They become a perpetual problem.
This is, again, at Darlington. This is a spent fuel pool under construction. So it's a rare time when you can see how deep and how strong the pool is. It's that deep because the nuclear fuel, once it's out of the reactor, has to be covered by 14 feet of water to cool it and to act as a shield for people in the building, so it retards the radiation.
Not only does it have to be covered with water, but that water has to circulate, and it has to have heat exchangers on it to remove the heat being generated still by the irradiated nuclear fuel. And it has to be cooled in this way for at least 7 to 10 years. If you were to drain the water out of the pool before that time, or if you were to remove the fuel from the pool before that time, the fuel would spontaneously overheat, and it wouldn't melt down, but it would damage itself, and you would get large releases of radioactive gases. About 20% of the fission products created by splitting the uranium atoms, about 20% of those substances are in fact gases. And those gases are, of course, easily liberated into the air upon damage. Here we have a picture of a full spent fuel bay at Gentilly, the Gentilly reactor in Quebec. You notice that catwalk there. The fact that the water is not only cooling the fuel, but also providing biological shielding, so that any person walking across that catwalk would be getting only a small dose of radiation. If it weren't for the water, it would be suicide to walk across the catwalk. The radiation levels would kill you.
After about 10 years in the pool, the fuel has cooled off enough that it can be taken out of the pool and put into these dry casks. So this is nuclear fuel in dry storage. They're enormously thick. They weigh 100 tons each, and so they're full of shielding. But then this is right now the final destination of nuclear fuel. They want to take it further, hopefully, and bury it in the shield. But for now, the fuel is either in the pools or it's in dry cask storage.
Now, even here, the nuclear industry, the NWMO, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, says that it's still too early to try and put this waste underground because there would be no way for the heat to be dissipated. It's still generating heat. And these things are air-cooled, so there is air circulating through them in order to cool and remove the heat still being generated by the irradiated fuel. They figure that you should wait for about 30 years before you even think about putting any of this underground. Now, this is an important fact to remember because if you just think about it for a minute, use your common sense. We have all these reactors operating, right? They're all producing this irradiated fuel, right? Well, it turns out that it's impossible to take all that stuff away and bury it. It's impossible because you have to wait 30 years for it to cool off. So it means that even if you move that stuff away as rapidly as humanly possible, you're still leaving behind 30 years worth of irradiated fuel at the reactor site. So you haven't eliminated the danger at the reactor site. It's still very dangerous. What you've done is you've transported the waste to another site and created new dangers over there. So in fact, moving the spent fuel without shutting the reactors down is just simply multiplying the problem and introducing a transportation link as well.
This is that test shaft in Manitoba, a quarter of a mile down into the Precambrian granite, the Great Canadian Shield in Manitoba. And we went down all the way to the bottom, and parts of it are messy and parts of it are these clean tunnels where they intend to put the fuel.
What do we wear?
Hard hats.
And
boots.
Rubber boots. Yes, when you go down here, you have to wear rubber boots because there's no doubt, everybody knows that this stuff is going to be flooded after you walk away from it. The only reason it's not flooded now is because they pump the water out of it. Anybody who's familiar with mining knows this. when you dig a mine, you have to pump the water out with huge pumps in order to keep the mine workings dry. Once those pumps stop, this thing is going to be flooded with water. And of course, water is the ultimate transport vehicle for transporting this waste somehow back to the surface. And that's a concern. So they say, well, we're going to really plug it well. Well, good. We're going to have 10 million year epoxy that's going to plug your granite holes. The fact of the matter is, I don't think we know how to dispose of anything. The human race has never really disposed of any toxic materials. To the best of my knowledge, there's no success stories. So we're trying to do something for the first time ever in the course of human history. We're basically trying to put this waste into a hole and tell nature not to meddle with it. And nature is not allowed to recycle it. Now, underground, it continues to generate heat. This is a picture from a mathematical model done by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. The temperature scale is indicated by the colors. And that red horizontal line represents the irradiated fuel generating heat 70 years after coming out of the nuclear reactor. Here is the picture 4,000 years after coming out of the reactor. Now, to understand this picture, you have to understand that the irradiated fuel is not just hot, but is actually generating heat. So if the heat has nowhere to go except into the rocks, it's going to heat up the surrounding rocks. So the rock formations get heated up, and it's nowhere for that heat to go except into more rocks. So this is what it looks like after 8,800 years. And by the way, this sequence of diagrams continues and only ends after about 50,000 years. They call this period of 50,000 years where the temperature rises and then returns back to normal. They call this the thermal pulse. Here we have a report from Great Britain in 1976, which says, and by the way, the man who wrote this report is a nuclear physicist who worked in the nuclear industry. He also worked in the bomb program in Britain. And he said, "We agree that it would be irresponsible and morally wrong to commit future generations to the consequences of fission power on a massive scale unless it has been demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that at least one method exists for the safe isolation of these wastes." Well, the question is, do we have such a method? And Hannes Alfvén, the Nobel Prize-winning Swedish physicist, said, you cannot claim that a problem has been solved simply by pointing to all the efforts that have been made to solve it. Although we have made great efforts to solve this problem, we still really have not solved it because there is no principle of science that allows us to predict the future over these very long periods of time. So we're really basically talking about putting it underground, sealing it up as best we can, and then walking away from it. That is perhaps the height of irresponsibility. I think we can just go ahead a little faster here and talk about a very important caveat, because the nuclear industry leads people to believe that they want to bury this waste, but do they really? In fact, most nuclear advocates in the world today, including Canadian nuclear advocates who are promoting expansion of the nuclear industry, don't want to bury the waste until they remove a substance from the waste called plutonium. Now here is the creation of plutonium. It turns out that every nuclear reactor creates a new substance not existing in nature, heavier than uranium, called plutonium. And it's created by a uranium atom being hit by a neutron and transforming itself into a plutonium atom. Now why does the nuclear industry want to get the plutonium out of the fuel? The reason why is because it can be used as a fuel for future nuclear reactors, and they know they're going to run out of uranium if they build tens of thousands of these nuclear reactors. So they need to get that plutonium out. The other use of plutonium is for bombs.
That would be the first use of plutonium, and this is the amount of plutonium in the Nagasaki bomb. That was a very primitive bomb, and only a penny's worth in terms of weight of that plutonium fissioned, and yet that was enough to destroy the city of Nagasaki. Now they understand how to hold that entire ball together and have the whole thing fission. So that modern nuclear warheads are much more powerful than the early ones. It doesn't give off much radiation. It's an alpha emitter. You could hold it in your hand, you could carry it in your suitcase, and that's all you need. 1 coffee cup's worth to make a bomb.
Last week, President Obama described it as a lump of material the size of an apple. That with this you can kill hundreds of thousands of people. And the summit that was held in Washington, D.C. just this last week was a summit to try and lock down all over the world these very dangerous materials, which are called strategic nuclear materials, of which plutonium is the main example. These are materials which can be used immediately in nuclear weapons. Well, the problem is that the nuclear industry and every nuclear reactor in the world is producing more plutonium every day that it operates. So while we're talking about controlling this material, we're continuing to generate more and more of it.
I call this picture the Madonna of the glove box. A glove box is a sealed containment area for handling plutonium. Because number one, it's pyrophoric, it will burst into flame in contact with air. And number two, you don't want to breathe any of the particles. I like this particular picture because there's 4 sets of hands, so it looks like she's a mutant. But that's just for an extra worker. I did not have to climb into the box to take this picture. There was another window on the other side.
Now you may very well wonder, how can she possibly be handling this material when I've been telling you that it will kill a human being in 20 seconds? Well, it's not this material that kills a human being in 20 seconds. This is plutonium. Plutonium gives off only a non-penetrating form of radiation called alpha radiation, which cannot penetrate through a sheet of paper. Huh? Microphone up higher, sorry. Which the alpha radiation cannot penetrate through a sheet of paper, and consequently she can handle it safely as long as she doesn't get it into her body. The reason for the glove box and all the precautions is to prevent her from inhaling or ingesting any of this material, because that could indeed be deadly. But the moral of the story is that once the plutonium has been separated from the fission products, it can be transported. People can actually carry this across borders without fear of detection, because that radiation will not trigger any alarms.
But we talked about inhaling plutonium. They say that radiation is invisible, but it's not really true. This is a photograph of a particle, which you cannot see because it's so small, of plutonium embedded in the lung tissue of an ape. And the spiky black lines represent the amount of bursts of alpha radiation that it gives off in a 48-hour period. And it has a half-life of 24,000 years. So if you inhale a microscopic particle of plutonium, which can be stopped by a single sheet of paper, but if it's embedded in your lung tissue, there is no sheet of paper to protect you from the bursts of alpha rays that are bombarding the thousands of cells within the radius of those spiky black lines.
So this explains the paradox as to how somebody can safely transport something so deadly. You may remember, some of you I see are old enough to remember, the Russian agent who was murdered in London by the small amount of polonium-210. Now polonium-210 is different from plutonium, but it is also an alpha emitter. And it explains why the man who did the murder could actually carry that safely on his body. As long as it's in a vial, a glass vial, it is perfectly safe to carry. It's only when it's poured into somebody's tea and goes into their body, as in the case of Alexander Litvinenko, that that man will die a horrible death. So we have this strange paradox, something which is deadly inside the body and yet relatively safe to transport.
Here we see that ball of plutonium again. It's in the center of the soccer ball, the white soccer ball shape. This is a model of a modern hydrogen bomb held up by Howard Moreland, who asked the question, what if I take a modern warhead, slice it down the middle, and open it up? What would it look like? And he did some research, American Encyclopedia, and talking to public relations people in the bomb factories, and he pieced it together so closely that the American government tried to prevent him from publishing his document, but he hadn't violated any secrets at all, and so he won the lawsuit. It would weigh 370 pounds, and it's 20 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb.
Recently, Obama and Medvedev from Russia signed an agreement to reduce their strategic weapons by 1/3. Question, how do you reduce a nuclear arsenal by 1/3? The answer is simple. You just remove the plutonium. Once you take the plutonium out of one of these weapons, they are harmless. Of course, the problem is that you're left with the plutonium. So they now have a problem of what to do with the plutonium, and that is a matter of great concern because we don't know how to wish it out of existence once we've created it. But it's certainly a lot better out of the bombs than in the bombs. And what they're talking about is ways and means of preventing that plutonium from ever being used for bombs again. Not an easy task. Now, I would like you to think about this situation between nuclear reactors on the one hand and nuclear bombs on the other hand. We're often told that the two technologies have very little in common. In fact, they have a great deal in common. What they have in common is plutonium. The nuclear reactor produces the plutonium, the nuclear bomb uses the plutonium. So that's a pretty straightforward connection. The only thing is, the plutonium from most nuclear power reactors is not used in bombs and will not be used in bombs for a long time to come because there is a firewall between the reactor and the bomb. And that firewall is the intense radioactivity that I described to you earlier. The intense radioactivity of the fission products, which would kill anybody who tried to walk off with one of these fuel bundles. So we have a natural firewall which helps to protect us against easy conversion of civilian nuclear power plutonium into weapons. Unfortunately, the nuclear industry wants to eliminate that firewall. They want to replace the firewall by something called a reprocessing plant.
In a reprocessing plant, you take the highly radioactive spent fuel, you chop it up remotely, and dissolve it in acid, creating a witch's brew of radioactive materials that also liberates the plutonium and the unused uranium, and you plate that out, and that's how you get the plutonium. But you're left with high-level, liquid, corrosive nuclear waste.
Now the problem is that the nuclear industry, as I said earlier, does not want to bury the waste. They want to build a reprocessing plant and separate the plutonium before they bury the rest of the waste. Now, the plutonium only represents about 1% of the irradiated fuel, but that 1% is what they consider to be valuable. The difficulty with reprocessing is that while the industry likes to call this recycling and paint it as a very green technology because now we're reusing this nuclear waste, 99% of the nuclear waste is not used this way. It is now in a much worse form. It's in an acid liquid solution, highly corrosive, highly radioactive, very mobile. And by the way, you notice the smokestack. A lot of these radioactive gases are immediately liberated as soon as you break open the uranium irradiated fuel bundles. But the worst thing about it is this: if you can recycle the plutonium out the front door for use as fuel, why can't you equally cycle it out the back door for use in bombs? So what you have done is you have eliminated the firewall and you've made it infinitely easier to take that plutonium and use it for bombs if any regime decides to do so. Even if you are not a country that wants to do this, how do you prevent workers or criminals or terrorists from stealing the separated plutonium once it has been removed from the fission products? Then they can take it to another place and fabricate bombs from it there. This is a very serious problem. To me, it's the #1 problem of the spread of nuclear power. Now, interestingly enough, you might think, well, this is surely not something we have to think about in Ontario. Well, in fact, in 1978, the Ontario Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning specifically addressed this question in some of their recommendations in a report called A Race Against Time. And what they said is, and this is verbatim quotes, spent fuel reprocessing should not be part of Ontario Hydro's system planning. Hence, there is no need for a central interim storage facility for spent fuel. All spent fuel should be stored at nuclear generating station sites, either in circulating water storage bays or in dry storage if this proves feasible. At that time, they had not perfected the dry storage. I don't believe it's perfect, but at least they've got it working. It goes on to say, we believe that a central facility would presuppose the reprocessing of spent fuel. It would also involve more transportation and social and environmental problems. Now, this is an important message from over 30 years ago to us. It's saying that these men who spent 3 years cross-examining experts with lawyers and listening to all the evidence reached the conclusion that putting all this irradiated fuel in one location is a bad idea. And the reason it's a bad idea is because inevitably the industry is going to want to reprocess it. They're going to want to dissolve that waste in acid and get that plutonium out before burying it. Consequently, the sensible thing seems to be to leave it where it is formed at the reactor sites until all the reactors are shut down and until there is an end to nuclear expansion, because at that point there is no incentive to do reprocessing. And at that point, then you could at least talk about the possibility of moving it. But it's still not clear that moving it is a good idea, because it just simply moves it from point A to point B. Why should it be safer at point B than it is at point A? So I do think that all of us have to reflect upon this very difficult problem, which is not really solved. Now, I'm going to jump ahead here. I'll go very quickly through this. Part 6, it's called, Can Nuclear Power Solve the Climate Change Problem? The answer is no, and more studies are saying this. And by the way, I don't think anybody believes that nuclear power can actually solve the climate change problem. What happens in the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they published this report some years ago, but there's many other reports available now. And they pointed out that nuclear power, which accounted for 16% of electricity in 2005, could work up to an 18% share of electricity by the year 2030. Now, if you look at renewable electricity, it's already, oh, I'm sorry, what's going on here? If you look at renewable electricity, it already accounted for 18% of electricity, world electricity supply in the year 2005. That's where nuclear power wants to be in 25 years. And the prospects for renewable electricity are much better. 30 to 35% share using only available technology. I'm sure there will be new technologies coming along, but they're not counting on that. They're saying if we just use existing renewable technology, we can go up to 30 to 35% in 25 years. That's a lot better than nuclear. Now, I'm not going to dwell on these points. I just want to mention to you that there are now, in the last year alone, there have been at least 5 reports published, very credible reports, which say that the nuclear renaissance simply is not happening and will not happen. There may be new reactors built, for sure, but these new reactors will not increase the role of nuclear power. The role of nuclear power will decrease. The reason being the old reactors will be shut down more rapidly than any new reactors can be built. So now I'm going to turn this over to Bob for the final section of this count, which is, so what do we do with nuclear waste then? What do we do with nuclear waste then? Here, this is the one, I think. Oh, that's the one.
I did some work with the Department of Energy to document the cleanup. And
sorry, it's touchy. No. I don't know how to go back. I used to have arrows. 2. Go back another one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And while I was talking with some people there, we developed this idea called rolling stewardship. It's a whole new way of thinking about this overwhelming, dark, difficult, impossible problem. What do you do with this waste? So this is a safety sign I saw at the Hanford plutonium finishing plant. I thought it was kind of cute. Stop, take 2 seconds, safety thought. And they make plutonium there with a 24,000-year half-life. Yeah, safety thought, that's a good idea. Let's think about safety. Now the father of nuclear safety is Carl Z. Morgan, also known as the father of health physics. He was hired during the Manhattan Project to try to determine how much radiation can workers sustain who are handling uranium and plutonium to build bombs. And that was his job. What is a safe level, Carl? You got to tell us. You see, he does not have a happy expression on his face. He has dedicated his life to this study. And he came to the conclusion early on, after many animal studies and lots of experiments, he came to the surprising conclusion: there is no safe level of radiation exposure. The industry did not like to hear that. But he remains firm in that principle, and he's not the only one who believes that. Now, if there is no safe level of radiation exposure, let's have a safety thought about what we're doing with this material. We are burying it. And we're burying it in containers that maybe have a 30, 40, 50-year life. And then they will be breached by the forces of nature. And there will be leaks, and they will repackage it into more containers, and there will be more leaks. So if there's no safe level of radiation exposure, then maybe there's a problem here. Maybe there's a problem like occurred in Idaho National Engineering Laboratory at their notorious Pit 9, where they buried hundreds of tons of waste in the 50s and 60s, and the barrels corroded, and they lost all the records of what they had buried there. So now the nuclear engineers happened to be, the day I was there, out in the field, outstanding in their field, trying to figure out how to approach exhuming this waste and categorizing it and treating it, because all they knew is there was something down there and they didn't know what and they didn't know how much. So that seems to be the inevitable fate of nuclear waste that you bury. So here's a man contemplating boxes. These are 4x6 carbon steel boxes that contain low-level radioactive waste. And what he's contemplating is he's looking at the last batch of these big boxes full of nuclear waste that is going to be buried in trenches. They put it in a trench, they cover it with dirt, and it's good for 30 years. But they've been doing that for a very long time, and they've decided now to graduate. And they're thinking even better safety thoughts now. They decided that's the last bunch that we're going to do that way. From now on, we're going to put them in underground vaults where they're not so subject to the moisture and the corrosive action of the dirt. So instead of being good for 50 years, they'll now be good for 300 years. Sounds like an improvement. But if you think about the fact that this waste is a problem, hundreds of thousands, even a million years, it still is not enough of a safety thought. These are barrels of plutonium-contaminated waste, waiting to be processed, waiting to be stashed away somewhere. And it was such a cloudy, beautiful day when the sunlight broke through the clouds. I had a real moment. I thought, it's God saying, let there be cleanup. And I said, why are they on the cement apron like that? And they said, well, in case there's a leak, you know, it's a barrier between the barrel and the environment. But 24,000-year half-life, you have to multiply it by 10 before you come to the end of the hazard. So we're talking 250,000 years for this stuff, and they're in barrels that won't last very long at all. Here is a symbol of wisdom. Safety thought in another tent, a temporary tent in Los Alamos where they invented the bomb. And yeah, they're trying hard to be smart about it. But in this case, the owl is not a symbol of wisdom. It's a symbol of a scary animal that will frighten off birds and rats from making nests among the nuclear waste and burrowing into the containers. It's meant to scare away the critters. A proper way to think about it safely is different than all these short-term, quite expensive things that only multiply the waste. Because when the barrels corrode, you have to dig them up, and then all the dirt also becomes nuclear waste. So it just expands and expands, and it's all short-term. So rolling stewardship is a different kind of an idea. It means you are thinking into the deep future, and your concern is your children and your grandchildren and the whole human race. And you're thinking in terms of the material itself, and you're thinking of it in great humility. This is not an arrogant, clever solution. This is a solution that begins where the other solutions leave off. It begins with the fact that we do not have a solution. So far, we don't know what we're doing. And given that, and being humble in the face of that reality, what do we do? So it requires being mindful of our own limitations, that we are ignorant. We might have a lot of money and we might have a lot of power, but we do not know what we are doing with this stuff. So we're humble in the face of our own limits, and we are humble in the face of the power of this material. This is a no trespassing sign at the welcome dump in Port Hope, a radioactive waste storage site. And I took one look at it and thought, yeah, that's the action of time on a sign, and also on the reaction of radiation on people that it's exposing them to. That it's inevitable that these materials, nothing can retard, slow down, or stop their radioactivity. If it's a half-life of 24,000 years, you can't burn it, crush it, bury it, or do anything to it that will change that rate of development. If you were religious, you would say that's God's law of how this material works. Nobody can stop it or change it. So to acknowledge that is to arrive at first base regarding this. And that means you don't put it in irretrievable shafts deep underground where you can't get back at it. What do you do with it? You package it in a way that you can move it forward to the next generation. And because the next generation will not be able to handle the nuclear waste any better than we are. So in that sense, how we are in the face of it helpless, we can assume that that's what the next generation will be as well, and the generation after that. So rolling stewardship means you package it as well as you can, and we have the technology for packaging it easily for 300 years. We know how to do that. So you move it gently forward. You pass it on. And to the next generation, they move it forward. And maybe, if we're lucky, somewhere along the line, someone will come up with an idea or a technique that we don't know anything about right now. We can't foresee that, but if they don't do that, then you keep it moving, and hence the name rolling stewardship. I'd just like to conclude with this image of the Port Hope uranium refinery. And it's the oldest refinery on the planet. It began by refining the radium that came down from Port Radium, then it switched to uranium during the Manhattan Project. And so that building's been there for 70 years, but in another 100 years, 200 years, it won't be there anymore. And Mother Nature and all her vigor will overrun the place and carry on. Except for the fact that the materials that are processed in that plant are of such a nature that they will remain hazardous and radioactive from here essentially to eternity. It handles uranium. Uranium has a half-life of 4.5 billion years, not to mention all of its other daughter products. So the materials that are no longer visible, buried in the soil, in the water, in the air, will trump the energy of Mother Nature, unless we figure out how to do it properly from here. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I have a question. I think I was here when Stephen Lewis stood on the stage. Where was he? At the Community Auditorium. And I think he had concluded that, reluctantly, that nuclear power was a way for us to save the negative effects of greenhouse gases. And for someone like Stephen Lewis to adopt that position, to me is very scary when I do understand and believe what you're saying. Mm-hmm. Have you got any comments on that?
Yes, I do. I think that a lot of well-meaning people, a lot of very sincere people have been led to believe that same thing. But I do not believe it, and I haven't believed it for a long time. I personally knew Amory Lovins when he was just getting started with his career and before he had founded the Rocky Mountain Institute. And I followed very carefully his analysis. And in fact, we used the methods of Amory Lovins, whom, in case some of you in the audience may not realize, he wrote a book in 1974 called Soft Energy Paths. And what he said is that even if you accept the fact that lifestyles are not likely to change, even if you accept the fact that consumerism is still going to be there, nevertheless, in a country like the United States of America, you could meet all of the energy needs using renewable or soft energy and not requiring on fossil fuels or nuclear. But the key to that is energy efficiency. The key to that is you have to invest first and foremost in energy efficiency. And to this day, we have no idea how much can be accomplished in this direction through a combination of renewables and energy efficiency. If you go down to Toronto and look at the Parliament buildings there, right across on College Street, there's the old Ontario Hydro building. That building has no furnace. And the reason is because the building itself is a solar collector. And so it actually requires no heating whatsoever. Now, the heating needs of Canada accounts for about 54% of our energy use. 54% of our energy use in Canada is for low temperature heat. If you can even cut that in half, you're accomplishing infinitely more than you can by tripling, quadrupling, or quintupling the nuclear industry. That's, I think, where we're missing the boat. I believe that if we invest in renewables, we're going to find that we don't need nuclear, and Ontario may be well on the way towards doing that. 2 years ago, we were told that there were 5 nuclear reactors that were going to be built, new nuclear reactors in Ontario. 3 of those have been cancelled, the other 2 have been indefinitely postponed, and now Ontario has embarked upon 184 ambitious renewable energy projects. And by the way, the energy demand in Ontario has been going down for the electricity demand, has been going down for 5 successive years. So this, I think, is something else. A lot of that was from economic downturn, but some of it was from a greater awareness of the possibility of energy efficiency. I think that if we invest in these things as a first priority, that we will find that we need nuclear less and less. I'm sorry this is a long answer, but I've got to tell you one story which is very heartening, and that is Germany. Germany, through a very curious circumstance, they had a Green Coalition government about 8 years ago. And that Green Coalition government passed a law saying that Germany was going to phase out of nuclear power. They had 17 nuclear reactors. They've already shut down 2 nuclear reactors. They're in the process of shutting down a 3rd one. And this policy is now being challenged and may be reversed politically with the Merkel government. But in the meantime, in those 8 years, they built 30,000 megawatts of wind power. 30,000 megawatts is twice as great as the entire Canadian nuclear industry. If all the nuclear reactors in Canada were running at top capacity, which they're not, some of them are shut down, some of them are running at very disappointing capacity factors, it would only be 15,000 megawatts. So they installed 30,000 megawatts of wind power in 8 years. I say without any fear of contradiction, it would be impossible to build 30,000 megawatts of nuclear in 10 years, in 8 years. It's just not possible. So I think that we're just beginning to realize what we have been missing. And I think that you can forgive somebody like Stephen Lewis for perhaps not having looked closely at what these numbers really represent. I don't think that nuclear is the answer. I can send to anybody in the room here, if you send me an email at this email address, I can send you those 5 studies I mentioned to you about the nuclear renaissance not happening. And one of the reasons it's not happening because it's too slow, too expensive, and doesn't address the problem in a timely way.
Thank you.
Oh, you want to say something? No. Sorry for the length of the answer. Another question?
Can you tell me, I've heard some estimates, but uranium itself is a limited quantity on the face of the Earth, right? So if they were to build all these reactors that they're talking about, you're going to run out of uranium to start with. So what would be the point?
Uranium has a limited quantity on the Earth. If they use all the reactors they're talking about, we'll eventually run out of uranium. That is the question.
And the industry's answer is plutonium. We start using plutonium. And that's why every country which has invested heavily in nuclear power, Russia, India, France, Britain, Japan, they all have invested also heavily in plutonium reprocessing. And the reason why is because they appreciate exactly what you're saying, that the uranium supplies are not going to be adequate, so we're going to start using plutonium. Well, they think that they can stretch the fuel supplies by using plutonium by a factor of 10. The difficulty is that to do that, you have to enter a very dangerous world in which plutonium is in constant circulation around the globe. And you have to imagine that you have such a good security force that Tony Soprano will never get his hands on any of it. And we just know from human experience that this is not realistic. Once you put something into commercial circulation, it's going to fall into the hands of criminals. And that's the scary thing. So it's really not a sustainable policy. And by the way, even the reactors that are supposed to use the plutonium, the so-called breeder reactors, they haven't been able to get any of them working properly. Another question? Maybe not.
It's on the web. It's part of the lead economy connection. And in that, they estimate that their nuclear power actually creates an energy deficit if you follow the extraction of the ores to the decommissioning of the plants. And I wondered if you knew anything about that.
This is the question is that according to a publication on the web, which has a lot of detail, that if you analyze the energy inputs to the nuclear industry compared with the energy that it supplies, that it's a net loser. That basically it uses more energy than it actually supplies. This is a claim and an analysis and an argument that goes back many decades. I mean, these arguments were raging in the 70s as well. I don't think it's absolutely clear, but certainly nuclear energy does require massive inputs of energy. For example, the enrichment plants, where they enrich the uranium, each one of those enrichment plants uses as much energy as a large city, and the only purpose of the enrichment plant is to enrich the uranium. So this is just an example of large energy inputs. But I'm not sure that I entirely believe that, because I'm just not convinced. Myself, I think that nuclear energy probably does, as long as the reactors operate at a sufficiently high level, that they do supply excess energy. But here's my problem. My problem is that not only must you spend huge amounts of money on building these plants, which means that you don't have that money to spend on other things. It's called the opportunity cost. Now, everybody understands the idea of opportunity cost. It means if you buy one expensive item, you can't buy the other expensive item because your money's gone. So buying nuclear power means that you can't buy a lot of other things. The difficulty, however, with nuclear is that after having spent all that money to build them, 20 years later, you have to spend even more money to refurbish them, to repair them. We're spending billions of dollars now fixing up these old reactors, and after they're fixed up, they're not running very well. And then 20 years after that, you have another big cost because you have to dismantle the reactors, which are now radioactive structures. That costs more billions of dollars. And then you have to deal with the radioactive waste. The NWMO itself estimates that this will cost at least $26 billion. So what you have here is not just one opportunity cost, but a whole series of opportunity costs which are going to go down to the next generation. It means that not only can you not now afford to invest in other things, but your children won't be able to either. So I think that that's one of the most telling arguments against the nuclear on the economic front. As far as the energy goes, I think it's an interesting debate, and it's something that I would be willing to look at anybody's figures on that. I'm not convinced that nuclear is a net loser of energy. I do believe it's a net waste of money. How about in the back there?
Yeah, I'd like to thank you for your excellent presentation on high-level nuclear energy. I guess here in the north we're faced with the mining of the waste Elliott Lake in northern Saskatchewan, really in other places. I guess the question is, do we have an idea of the enormity of that problem?
The question is, while we're talking here about the high-level radioactive waste and what that might mean for northern Canada, northern Ontario, northern Saskatchewan, we already have had years, decades of extraction of uranium in northern Ontario, well, Elliott Lake area, and also in northern Saskatchewan. Do you have, the question is, do you have anything to say about the legacy, the radioactive legacy of that? Indeed, indeed, that's a very heavy legacy indeed. It turns out that when the uranium is extracted from the ore, 85% of the radioactivity is actually left behind in the residues. So they only take away the least radioactive portion of the ore. The uranium is not the most dangerous material. It turns out that uranium, being radioactive, as we discussed earlier, it does disintegrate naturally. And when it disintegrates, it changes into a bunch of other things, all of which are far more dangerous even than uranium. Not to say that uranium isn't dangerous too, but one of the byproducts of uranium is radium. And radium has killed an awful lot of people. In fact, radium is probably one of the biggest killers in the early 20th century of people who came in contact with it. You can read lots of stories on the internet about radium poisoning. Every atom of radon gas, you've heard about radon gas and how radon gas kills people. In fact, on the EPA website, they say it's about 20,000 Americans every year are dying from simply breathing radon gas in their homes. Every atom of radon gas comes from an atom of radium, which in turn comes from an atom of uranium. So uranium is actually the grandfather of all of these radioactive substances. Another one is polonium-210. We mentioned that earlier. That's another substance that comes from uranium. So when they mine uranium, they actually only take away they skim the cream off the top. Sorry, this is gone. They sort of skim the cream off the top. Is this gone dead? Is this working anymore? No. Okay, when they mine uranium, it's as if they skim the cream off the top and they leave all the rest behind, and the rest has a half-life of about 76,000 years, and it's 250 million tons. Bob and I have given a talk called The Radioactive Legacy of the Nuclear Age in Stockholm, Sweden. It's on our website. If you go there, you can listen to the slideshow. And we talk about the uranium problem as well as the high-level waste problem, as well as some of those other problems that we didn't talk about. today. Any other questions? Yes, yes.
Do you know anything about the nuclear waste